Hello there, all you fine feathered folk out there on the tubes of you, and welcome to another glorious installment of the Disinformed Book Club. I'm Shane,
I'm Michael.
I'm Courtney.
and we are thrilled to be back for yet another installment in the saga that is our constant readerism, as it were, and we finish up the mythic saga of Bill Hodges as we finally get around to that glorious tale, End of Watch. And we will start off by saying, of course, if you are unfamiliar with us, we are three-quarters of the hosts of the wildly popular Disinformed podcast, which flees your preferred provider app every marvelous Monday morning. We have a show where we talk about random esoterica and we lie about it. It's immensely entertaining. But what we are doing here is sharing our mutual love and admiration for most of the material written by Stephen King, in addition to a bevy of other books that I'm sure we will get to at some point in the future once I have completed my quota, because obviously I am of paramount importance here. But we have started this whole thing off by me making a quick recommendation to Courtney to scope out If It Bleeds back in the day, because I had just finished it and thought it was a delightful collection of short stories. And now, 5 books later, we are through at least a portion of the Holly Gibney contingent of the King material. But this finally has closed the circle, if it will, even though Ka is in fact a wheel.
Mm-hmm.
You have finally seen the full spectrum of Holly, and no, that was not a joke.
I was about to be like, ooh, choice of words.
Terrible. I know.
Ugh.
But we're also going to mention off the top here, there will likely be spoilers in the course of the discussion. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want to have anything ruined for you, then please discontinue or check in with us later on. Or, just hang in and see whether or not you're inclined to read the book after we get through chatting. But off the tip here, anything either of you want to say about your impressions of End of Watch and the Hodges trilogy in totality?
I'm just glad we didn't make bets on how this was going to end, because I would have lost money and that would have been sad, because I could have never in a million years thought up this ending.
Yeah.
That's true.
Having gone through some very circuitous routes with King recently in my reading through of the Talisman, which Courtney was not subjected to the full breadth and depth of my rant previously, but it can get weirder, no question. But I really enjoyed this, particularly in the context of the rest of the series and everything that preceded it. This is where you finally get to watch some things go off the rails and veer back into more of the Kingverse feel versus some of the more procedural stuff that we've had prior to this. So I thought Michael, of anyone, would have been far more entertained, given you've said that this is more your speed.
It's weird. I feel like I should have enjoyed it more than I actually did. Now,
Okay.
that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy
Ooh.
it. For some reason, and I was asking myself why during the whole time I was reading it, why I didn't enjoy it. And we can get to that later.
Okay.
But just base impression, it was a good book and it was a good trilogy. I'm glad that we read it so I can experience Stephen King in more than just his typical genre, his typical approach to
Or what is
writing.
typically ascribed to him as his
Yes.
genre, right? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so we'll start out where we left off. Of course, we have a Brady Hartsfield who is still supposed to be comatose and non-responsive, occasionally being visited by a Bill Hodges who would throw an antagonistic phrase or two his way, and then head back out into the wintry nights. And we have now found Bill where he and Holly have officially established finders keepers, which is fantastic and entertaining, and how we initially integrate their connection to the story proper and how Brady gets brought back into the situation is really fascinating. I love that we start out yet again with another procedural where we're checking out, a rash of individuals who have
Go commit
self-harmed
and die.
in a
Go commit
permanent
online.
state. Yes, yes.
Yes.
Apologies again. There will be some triggers here because we are going to have to discuss material found within the
Yes.
book, and some of it can be a little bit problematic.
Considering
yes.
he is the prince of this particular act,
He
it makes
does
sense that we
enjoy
throw that out. Yes.
things being a little squeamish, yes, but in particular, trigger warning going forward, suicide is something that is writ large throughout the course
Yeah.
of this story, and you can't talk about this book without really getting into it. But we find Bill doing some interesting investigation along with Pete Huntley, who you now get to see the connective tissue of how he gets brought back into the fold for all of the things that would happen going forward. And
Yeah.
certainly not as capable as Bill, which is illustrated here in spades.
Mhm.
But so there's a rash of suicides occurring, and all of them seem to have a similar theme, which oddly enough ties them to individuals who endured the tragedy of the terrorist attack perpetrated by Mr. Hartsfield. So, starting out with that, how was that for a hook for everybody?
It was good. I liked it still kept to the theme of the previous two books. And it was just a really good hook that started encompassing everything that was just like really that I really enjoyed about the previous two books. Specifically the first one, and why I enjoyed it so much. Just like the idea of how he plays, how everything is played out. That it wasn't just like a run of the mill in specifically suicide. Especially considering a lot of the what is it? Not paradoxical inconsistencies between the characters and their motivations and what they're doing and the actual act itself. I thought that was very motivating and definitely something that was intriguing that I wanted to know more about.
Well, it also contains a lot of the MO and the mechanisms that Brady had utilized previously to antagonize people into similar circumstances.
Yes.
So they bleed supernatural elements into the story very gradually, and it's something that's done tastefully, and that it's something that, as cause of fact, as we see later on with The Outsider as well, that the more, how shall we say, fantastical elements don't just jump out at you immediately. They start with something that is very writ to fact. And then when the exceptions start to manifest, you go, okay, this is an anomaly that is so far out of field that it's ludicrous to even entertain as a notion. But then they start having to. So how about you, Courtney? Was that interesting enough off the top?
Yeah, it brought it full circle where it was like when they started investigating, I was like, how could he still be involved at this level and still be compelling people to commit this act? Like, how are they going to tie that back in? Because they left us in a place where he was incapacitated. So for Brady to have any kind of connection to it was like, maybe, but like it has to, right?
It also, unless he was prescient and knew that, and I mean, granted, he would have known that there were survivors and could have had machinations where he had set these things up years in advance, but still, it's a lot of pre-planning in order to make that work.
I don't think that he would have done that, considering a lot of things that gets him eventually caught in the first book and in the third was that he took risks that he acknowledged were bad.
Yes.
But he was like, well, why not? You gotta, break a few eggs to make an omelet. That
Indeed.
sort of thing.
So we start to move forward, and as we pick up momentum over the course of the story, there are multiple incidents that occur that they're all running. Of course, the link that we see that interconnects a lot of these things is, of course, the large letter Z indicated in places. And a lot of these fun sort of like, I always interpreted it as kind of like a nod to the Zodiac Killer initially. But there, you can read this any other. You can go Zorro. There's all sorts of ways that you can interpret this. But I found, having read a lot of similar like true crime stories, having investigated multiple murderers and things like this, a lot of interesting elements thrown throughout. And obviously something Courtney and I talked about offline previously is you can see that there was a decent amount of research done in the making of this book in particular to ferret out a lot of the technological instances that we're going to get into later. So it's a little more Michael Crichton than it is your typical Stephen King story, which is something I also appreciated.
But I do appreciate, because he does this with a lot of his books, especially if you read the acknowledgments at the end of each book, like whenever it involves something that, like the girl who loved Tom Gordon, he thanked a couple of people, if I recall correctly, about the knowledge of like survival, like survivalism and everything like that, so he could adequately or accurately incorporate it into the books. So that's one thing I enjoy about Stephen King, is that when he writes about something that is beyond his typical knowledge, he doesn't just make it up as he goes along. He recruits help so that he has a better understanding of it, so that he can pass that understanding on to us.
Absolutely. There's more of the recent material as well, like Billy Summers is a prime example, where you've got an individual who is a hitman. So obviously there's a significant amount of research that had to go into that. So yes, his thanks are long and very well researched as well. But so eventually we get to the point where it is finally revealed through us seeing into the mind of Brady Hartsfield that he is still very much alive and cognitively functional within his little flesh tomb, and begins to discover that he has both telekinetic and telepathic abilities, which completes the King triumvirate here of incorporating all of your standard fare into it. But I was like, okay, so we got TK and TP in here, so as I can appreciate it. But the mental telepathy, astral projection, all of the other things that we find here, how did that strike each of you? Michael, since you are the one who appreciates supernatural material, I think this is where I see you start to raise your eyebrows.
So the whole premise of it was fantastic. Also, the slight Dark Tower nod. Mwah.
I know you were very excited about that. Yes, being able to.
As soon as I came across that, I was like, "What?" Immediate sent you a text. Sorry, because I was pantomiming me texting, but I realized it wasn't in the camera shot. So
you could have been working a zap it. We don't know. You might have been chasing some fish.
Just zoning out there watching it. But yeah, how he accessed all these things was absolutely fantastic. That it was one of those things where it was a subtle nod, like, hey, you read Dark Tower, you were gonna like this more. Overall, I liked how it played out. I liked whenever I deal with supernatural, there's either two avenues I like to go through.
Incest.
Yes. Well, okay.
sorry, Wincest.
You're right. 3. You got the Wincest. Okay, Winchester, supernatural, all that other fun stuff. But the other two, you have the completely like Lovecraftian, nothing is supposed to make sense, not because it's like it has no rules, it's supposed to be beyond your comprehension.
From the mouth of madness, yes.
Exactly. And then other times where there are set rules or set like things that govern how things work. I'm more used to the more Lovecraftian elements of Stephen King from the previous works that I read. And so when he was approaching it from the other way, where the rules are more set, more grounded, where you can understand it, I think that's what kind of took me out of it slightly. Not to say that I didn't enjoy the book. I loved it, but I feel like I was expecting something that was more Lovecraftian, more cosmic horror-esque, as opposed to the more, I almost say pedestrian supernatural, because I feel like I don't want to say that because that belittles it. Not I was gonna say earthly.
Yeah, but given Brady's character in particular, and having the intellectual grounding, and then having more of a technological background, using that as the sort of doorway by which he enters in people's consciousnesses, I think is pretty interesting.
It is, and I love the fact that it all has those set rules and everything. They don't try and like break the rules as soon as they're established, like, because that's one of my pet peeves. For some reason, it just didn't click as well with me as it should have. Like, I was reading it being like, I should enjoy this a lot more than it is. And I think it's just because I was hoping more for the Lovecraftian, and I have no idea why. The only thing I can think of is the way that The Outsider was in the kind of spoil a little bit for The Outsider for people that haven't watched it yet or read it. Watched it.
This is the book club, not the HBO Max club. Thank you.
We're just sitting here with the stroke going on.
Hand check.
right here. But in The Outsider, Holly kind of makes it sound like a supernatural entity had kind of possessed Brady, and hijinks ensued from that. So I think I was more expecting that aspect as opposed to The Outsider. Like, I don't know. I think if I
Okay,
had,
I think it's, yeah, you're making a correlation based on what the
yes,
outsider presented of her just saying she's experienced some things that you would not believe if you were
yeah,
governed by the laws of reality and science, etc.
yes.
So,
And so I was expecting more Lovecraftian, and I think
okay.
that because of that expectation soured my enjoyment of the book as much as it could.
Okay.
Because by all accounts, I should have enjoyed this book. I just didn't as much as I should.
All right. Yeah,
I'm glad you understand what I'm
it's
trying to get at.
I don't, but I'm just going to move past it because
Okay, good, perfect.
no, it's just one of those. It's interesting, and I think one of the bits of enjoyment that I have is that, again, I was reading things piecemeal as well. I'm just grabbing stuff randomly as I'm going through as well, and so how you discover a book and the sequence in which you read it is something like, for instance, Courtney, having not read The Dark Tower and not having the connective tissues that you're thinking of,
Yeah.
is not going to understand the sort of Roland-esque aspect of opening somebody's mind and seeing through their eyes and then taking control of them as a person.
Mhm.
So interesting that, the things that enliven you and get you excited about something, very likely, dramatically different for Courtney. So
Mhm.
how about you for the supernatural bent here, Courtney? How did it strike you?
I think at first it was a little bit of a like superhero eye roll for me, where
Okay.
I was just like, really? Like that's how we're gonna play this out?
Huh.
Not because it's like necessarily like a bad plot device, but for
Mhm.
me it was more of like, oh, I thought we were gonna get like more supernatural, more spooky, I guess.
Okay.
But I think once the technology side came into play, it made more sense for me. Like it flushed itself out in the sense of we started with him as basically like a computer hacker, and then to get to the point where he's using technology to manipulate people, and a little bit of his new gifts. I think that worked for me. I'd be curious to know from you guys though, as far as like, because we've talked about the shine a lot throughout all of our conversations of King's books, like how do you think that factors into this series? Because I feel like he might have had it if he hadn't been evil.
So, an overarching theory that I think I've mentioned before that I have is that all of his characters that he actually writes about in second person have some version of the shine. And I think I've said that before. Again, it's a theory. I don't think it actually is true, but it's just something that I like approaching whenever I read about a new character and stuff like that. So to kind of be a little bit more specific, I think that he does have the shine, and that it only took, a couple blows to the head for it to really manifest. And it just became a lot stronger than what it was beforehand, because in the first book, if I recall correctly, he had hunches
Mhm.
that he kind of followed, and that's kind of like the main aspect of the shine that is prevalent in a lot of characters, where it's just like a hunch of
Well,
things.
I mean, he is able to somewhat innately figure out what people are afraid of and prey on their anxieties and things
Mhm.
like that. So yes, there is a degree of clairvoyance that you see there, which is often associated with some of his telekinetic characters as well, which is where we have some connectivity with Carrie.
Mhm.
Certainly Jake with the Dark Tower, and then in addition, prior members of I think Jamie is the one that they said also had some of the shine.
Yes,
So
the bit of the touch
yes,
to refer
so
back. Yeah.
they do have a thread that runs throughout. In particular, we've talked about this relative to The Stand as well, and how that manifests with the young child whose name has just slipped my mind presently, Joe. I'm
Yes.
forgetting what his given name was,
Yeah.
but so
Oh,
you
goodness.
see a lot of these things, and Jake and Joe, and you see a lot of similarities here. But no, it's not totally outside the realm of possibility, and I think given the other abilities that you see on display here, some element of the shine is certainly there.
Mhm.
But as we move into that, we don't have to belabor too much of it, but I enjoyed the possession aspects of him, particularly taking over people that he, had a horrible esteem for. Dr. Babineau in particular, or Mr. Z as we move along, that it's just pure disdain that drives him to be like, I didn't appreciate how smarmy you were with me, so I'm going to take over your body. And you're going to be my little linchpin here that I utilize, the Renfield to my Dracula, as we move in. And then how it eventually brings in Freddie, his former co-worker, and how she goes through programming all of the failed Zappets and helping to distribute them in order to execute the master plans. Interesting plot device.
I was kind of happy that they brought back, like, it wasn't just like, oh yeah, he's a computer guy so we can take advantage. It's like, no, they're calling back to a lot of the stuff that happened in the first book, taking characters that happened in the first book. So I thought it was really cool to see Freddie back.
It's also one of the few human connections he had outside of his mother that you see illustrated.
Exactly.
So it's very important to at least have some grounding there.
Yeah, and that was the whole reason why she was kind of recruited into his machinations at the beginning, because she was like, hey, I have a picture that was in your desk and here it is, bye. Like,
yep. Just trying to be kind. But Courtney, I remember you were saying as you were reading that when the Zappets started to get integrated, that was the thing that you were particularly it was a fanciful twist that you weren't anticipating.
Yeah, I felt like the idea of taking something that was kind of a defunct technology and then going through all this trouble of buying it, programming it, and doing all this just so he could be more chaotic was like, that's so much work to get to that point, and just the determination that it takes. And I think like Bill was a big part of that. I think that maybe if Bill hadn't spurred him on as much or given him that motivation to like, oh, okay, you think I'm done, old man? Like, let me show you what I can actually do. I think the story would have been different. So I thought the dynamic, especially it being technology, because Bill was not technologically advanced, made it a really interesting plot device.
And thus, we link to the critical element, and of course, what brought us to the dance in the first place was me talking about the evolution of Holly Gibney from the first time that we encounter her all the way through the end of If It Bleeds, and seeing that metamorphosis. And it's a very gradual process, that sort of the unfolding of a flower, if you will. And so I appreciate that, one, she is part of the element, but even when you get into the later portions of the book and the confrontations, when you finally get Brady cornered in a body that is no longer his own, which is always interesting, how he considers Holly to be his liberator, in fact, because he didn't see these abilities and didn't have them until she gave him an old clout to the side of the cranium. And so somehow, like, he doesn't hate her as much because of this, and the vitriol and the anger and animosity is all directed towards Bill for being the antagonist, which is just an interesting play. But Holly goes through a bit of a ride over the course of this story, and I had forgotten it just until I was brushing up as well, that you do get to the end of the story, and she does have the moment where she's about to help and doesn't quite nail the dismount and falls back on the old crutches, slapping herself and being self-deprecating and losing that faith, which is really frustrating when you're completing this cycle. So you can see why I got a lot more excited when she pops up in The Outsider, and then when If It Bleeds manifests, that you do give her another shot of redemption, and she does have the role that she plays in The Outsider. So when I talked about that in the context of that book, I really appreciated that she was the one who did it. And finally, the happy slapper gets brought out again. So it's really lovely to be able to give her another bite at the apple, and it doesn't just leave her there having faltered on the goal line. But how did that strike everybody else as you were reading?
No, I thought it was a perfect ending because it had both of them. Jerome did play an element towards the end.
It's a very big part with Jerome, I would say.
Yeah. But it was cool that it focused primarily on them two and their relationship, and how Bill was like, no, you got to stay here. You got to be my backup. And then she's like, well, I'm going to be your backup, but not in the way that you needed or wanted. And it was great. It was like the perfect summation to their relationship as like just partners, not just, backup and, first place, second place, but like partners.
Yeah.
And I really, really enjoyed how that played out.
And
It's a very fitting end.
he's also, for again catching folks up who are not familiar with the book, is got pancreatic cancer at this point. It is physically debilitated and is in a severe amount of pain as they are trying to finally attempt Brady, who is essentially body hopping at this point, where his consciousness has transposed itself outside of his actual body and he is dead technically by this point, and is now, out floating around in the possessed Dr. Babineau. So interesting, but Bill has got a lot of hurdles to try to clear by the time we get here to finally catch the crook again, which is really difficult to watch him go through that as well. But then having Holly to rely upon and seeing that relationship continue is really great. But Courtney, was it everything that I had built it up to be, or did it fall a little short of the goal? But it really fills in a lot of those spaces for me. I know.
Yeah. And I think what's funny about it too is if I hadn't read The Outsider, I would have expected Holly to die during the confrontation. Like I was almost waiting for that, even knowing full well that there's a whole nother book about her, just because of the way it was kind of played out. I was like, how are they going to survive this? And I thought that was really clever to have that suspense, because I feel like with a lot of these types of books, like you don't expect the good guys to win every time. And of course, with the cancer prognosis, like obviously that does play into it. Yeah. But as far as like taking down the bad guy, you expect there to be some kind of casualty within like the midst of the core group of characters. So I thought that was really interesting. I want more and more Holly books.
Agreed.
She's just such an endearing character. And I think you had really teased a lot, like the growth that she was going to have throughout the trilogy, and then to continue that into The Outsider. And then If It Bleeds, it's just really great character growth.
Oh yeah.
And, we all struggle with self-doubt. And for her, as a self-proclaimed outsider who can sort of sense these things from also being other or excluded or ostracized and kind of on the fringes just based on how she conducts herself and sees things, it's interesting to sort of watch these situations manifest through her eyes. And she's the one who is the fastest to, shirk disbelief and say like, no, this is where the logical conclusion takes us. And, fantastical or hyperbolic as it may be, it's where the clues are taking us. So let's just follow the trail. Yeah. And so as a detective, that sort of dogged determination and the flexibility to be able to wrap your mind around something that is just beyond the realm of possibility to everybody else is really unique to that character, which is a lot of fun. One of the reasons why I think she's very charming.
One of my favorite parts when she had already accepted what was going on, Bill didn't, was like, don't be like Mrs. Green Eyes. And it was like it was a very great point, because her distaste of Lizzie, yeah, was just, it was interesting that it was an interesting interplay between the actual cop and Holly, and just like how they operated and how they disliked each other because they both wouldn't get along well at all.
Right.
And how she was calling out Bill for kind of like blinding himself to that possibility that it was supernatural.
Yes.
And was saying, don't be like Miss Green Eyes. I think I'm saying the right line.
It's been a minute, and again, I didn't run through the whole thing again, but
whatever her color eyes were, blue, green, indigo, violet,
mauve.
Whatever. Yeah, mauve.
The mauve hand. But in somebody who, again, the reason they're brought in initially is because, she, relative to Pete, it's like, this is going to be way too much work. We're not going to link all these things together. I don't want to waste the effort to try to make this. It's like, the guy's a vegetable. Why should we waste the time trying to figure out this? Like, yeah, there's some weird stuff going on, but who cares? Just scrap it. And yeah, this is somebody who offed themselves. Why should we care? Why should we get involved?
And I understood. And again, I love Stephen King for his characters. she wasn't a likable character, but we understood her motivation. She wanted to be, chief of police. And it wasn't just because she was seeking power. She also wanted to validate the idea that women could do that. So it was just really cool to where it's like, well, I don't like her as a person, but I can understand her motivations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it was cool seeing that this sort of dichotomy between the two, and then her just reminding Bill not to be just for the acclaim.
Yeah, you don't want the wooden or the static characters. And by and large, with notable exceptions,
oh no,
you don't encounter those very often over the course of King. But I feel like there is a purpose where, particularly in a lot of the stories I've encountered, even when it's distasteful to me, they are kind of a fulcrum around which the story revolves. And I've said this in particular with a lot of characters that I've stumbled across as we went through. And Fran's mother in particular with the Stand is something like I just was repellent to me as a concept, but very necessary for the 70s story that was being told at the time. And the thing that I love about King is he is very mired in the moment. There's a lot of pop cultural references. I am reading The Long Walk right now, which is a Bachman book. But at one point, like, even though this is a very different reality from the one we exist in, he just throws John Travolta in the mix as being on a magazine cover. And I'm like, okay, I appreciate this. But then, of course, you get into the Dark Tower and you see how all of these things pool, and it all makes sense once you have that touchstone to return to and float back out. But we're not talking about that here. We're going to stay.
Unfortunately, no.
But, the nice thing is that everything does kind of blossom out. And once you start to see those tendrils, it's impossible not to see them any longer, which is something I really love about it. And why I have started becoming the acolyte, spreading all of this joy to all of you. So, as per usual, we'll wrap the thing up. We're not going to sit and run a post-mortem over the whole thing. I was despondent to see Bill go, but of course...
Yep. But you love to watch him leave.
That is America's ass.
Oh no!
But I feel like very necessary to get some fruition to the story, and I feel like it was that was the one thing if I'm going to harangue anything about the story, is that we go from him being in a hospital bed and go like, things might look up, and having a meal with everybody, and then it's like cut to the graveside. You're like, okay, wow, there's a time jump. Yeah, so it's like, I guess it's one of those like, I just want to finish this thing already. But
why won't you die already?
But, some have to die so others may live, I suppose. So we're going to get a lot of Holly Gibney stories going forward. And how do you feel about that? You can let us know in the comments. I'm sure that we'll have plenty of folks engaging, as Michael would extol you to do. But as always, the Disinformed Book Club thing, which I've stolen from an imbecile named Dave Meltzer, but we're going to run with it regardless. So as we're going with the books here, what do we think? Thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs in the middle for End of Watch?
Oh, definitely thumbs up.
Well,
regardless
I'm
of what I was expecting,
well.
Thumbs up. Great book to read.
Fabulous.
Annoyed that I didn't like it as much.
Well, but again, context is very helpful in explaining that you did go in with expectations, and a lot of that is very likely attributed to me explaining some of the things that happened. But I feel like, does it make a little more sense with me saying you have to really understand all of the aspects of this to get you to where Holly is in the other two books?
Oh yeah, most certainly. Like, it was that is probably the best takeaway from this trilogy, is just the evolution of Holly.
Yes.
And it makes, I honestly almost want to reread The Outsider now with that in mind, just to see the evolution, and then right after that, just If It Bleeds, that short story within it, just to see, like, to get the full like chronological evolution, instead of just knowing where she ended at and then just appreciating the journey too. I don't know if I would do that for a book club, considering we just recently talked about it. We'd probably save that for a long time in the future. But
as I've said, Outsider is still probably one of my favorites, and the fact that I backdoored my way into it by the way of reading If It Bleeds and going, oh, I had no idea that Holly was a character in The Outsider. All right, well, that's interesting. I guess I'll check that out, because it was not sold to me very well when I was initially reviewed by some of my colleagues. And going back into it, I read that thing in a day. So obviously, I have a great affinity for the story. But at the same time, when you get to the end of that story, teaser for if we do get around to discussing The Outsider again, outside of those who enjoyed it at Phoenix Fan Fusion with us this year, which that was still probably one of my favorites of the weekend. That was a good discussion.
Absolutely.
Very good. Yeah.
Holly electing to go into the cave and following, and then the things that I was getting the proverbial tingles, as we've talked about in reading that, of just being giddy at seeing like, okay, this is her chance, and then seeing how everything played out for the end of that story was really fantastic as a bit of closure for fans of the Mr. Mercedes series. It's really fun to watch her put in similar circumstances and be able to take charge and be the one who's kind of running the show by the end of it. Was just great. So it will certainly put a different complexion on the stories as you read things going forward.
Oh yeah.
Well, I think that is going to officially close the cover on this particular discussion, and I know Michael loves that metaphor, so we're just going to run with it. But we appreciate you all being here as per usual. There's going to be a link in the show notes below, so you can check out all of our relevant socials. Of course, we have new episodes of our podcast winging your way every lovely Monday morning, so please go subscribe there if you are inclined. You can check us out and see if you're as entertained by our discussions here. But if you have enjoyed this discussion in particular, Michael has got some instructions for you.
Smash that like button, ring the bell, hit subscribe, leave a comment, set phasers to engage. I think I got it. I think I finally got it after like dozens of episodes.
Yeah, I mean, we've only been doing this for a few years. That's fine. Like Holly, you have gone through a metamorphosis yourself, and you're getting braver, bolder, and better by the day.
I wouldn't insult Holly like that.
Well, as you've indicated, you're both neurodivergent, so there's simulacrum.
I mean, that's true. That's very true. That's why she's awesome in my eyes.
Give yourself a little patience. Don't just sit there and slap yourself in the face and yell at yourself. That's for me to do.
I'm still at the point outside of that first funeral, just smoking a cigarette. Got so much more to go.
For those of you out there, I am not smoking, and I am taking my Lexapro. But thank you all for being here as always. We also have a slew of other material on this channel as well, including Michael's shorts, which you can or can't investigate if you're inclined. And of course, our other show here, Disinformed After Dark, which we do as sort of a denouement at the end of our episodes, decompress, have a little chat, doing similar things to this, and diving into the supertheticals of Chuck Klosterman, which you can see over my left shoulder here, which we had a very fun one with Michael and I last week, which I was very tickled by, and we went in weird, wild directions I did not anticipate. So I was particularly fond of that one as a chat. So go check that one out once it is, if you haven't already seen it, which you should have chronologically. But all right, I'm going to quit meandering my way out of this and finally wrap this thing up. So in closing, thank you all for being here with us, and keep on reading, friends. It's always appreciated. So for the book club this week, I'm Shane.
I'm Michael.
And I'm still tapping pink fish.
Ooh, reference.
I'm Courtney.
And zippity zoop, we're out of here.
Case closed.